Hey, welcome back, Mr. Cook again. Today we're going to go over Elizabethan Theatre. Remember, this supplements our textbooks, basic drama problems, our projects. Read pages 451 to 457, Elizabethan Theatre. A PDF of this chapter is posted online. Our essential question for this section is, what did Elizabethan Theatre contribute to theater and essentially to the world? Your objective is you're going to learn about the different theater forms, the playwrights, and a little bit about history involving theater to set the roots for modern theater. By the end of class, hopefully you'll have enjoyed my lecture because I'm always amazing, and have read the bit on Elizabethan Theatre, do any projects I have listed, and take the quiz. So Elizabethan Theatre, this is still part of the Renaissance, but it's what's happening in England, and it starts with Queen Elizabeth I. During this time period in history, England had a whole bunch of national pride. A whole bunch of good stuff was happening with their countries. They're doing lots of voyages of discovery. Remember, this is when the Americas was still new. This is when we were still looking for trade routes to India and China, overland and across sea. And the English Empire was very much expanding, and people were very proud of that. There were wars going on, and at this time, the most powerful nation was one considered with the most powerful navy. Whoever controlled the seas controlled all the trade routes. Well, England took on the biggest navy at the time, which was known as the Spanish Armada, and they defeated it, which opened up the whole world for England. There was lots more expanding trade markets. As I mentioned, as the routes opened up, new stuff was being found to trade, new areas were being found to trade with. The literary level, the education of people in general rose. Remember, we discussed that in the Renaissance. And England started putting out a bunch of printed books around 1475, thanks to Gutenberg. And by printed books, I don't just mean the Bible. Much literature. Remember, during the Renaissance, the Greeks were rediscovered, education was rediscovered, and there were lots of great playwrights and writers out there. We mentioned in Spain people like Cervantes with Don Quixote. This was going across Europe, and people wanted to read these books. With printing, it made it accessible to everybody, just not the nobility. Now, one of the things that really helped theater in England is Queen Elizabeth was a friend of theater. She heavily supported it. Against her were like the local mayors and several civil authorities. They did not like the idea of theater. They were afraid it would spread disease, and they were afraid of people massing together, there'd be lots of fights. However, Queen Elizabeth, she commanded, that means by order, she said, hey, let's get together and have lots of court performances. This is where the actors came in and performed for the court. And she protected these groups by giving them sponsorship. She was a patron of the arts. She also gave London's theater activities her approval. If the Queen approves, it's hard for you to argue against it. The Elizabethan period was considered an age of literary enlightenment. Many, many brilliant playwrights came up, and they wrote with a lot of freedom. What happened is they disregarded what were called the classical unities of time and place. We discussed this a little in Greek theater. Remember, the Greeks came up with these rules of what can be in theater, what can theater about, what can be the forms. The English said, bah! They ignored these rules. A big rule they ignored is the Greeks believed that violence should not be seen on stage. If you remember before, I would talk about in the Greeks how if there was violence, they'd refer to it off stage and then drag the body on later. English liked their violence, and they put lots of violence on the stage, which really made the crowd happy. Their writing, they mixed poetry and prose. It wasn't one or the other. It was a mix. They mixed comedy and tragedy. Once again, it wasn't one or the other. They would mix them both together. Out of this period, three great playwrights came: Christopher Marlowe, Ben Jonson, and of course, as everybody knows, William Shakespeare. Now, Christopher Marlowe, next to Shakespeare, is considered probably one of the greatest playwrights ever, particularly one of the great writers of tragedy. Unfortunately, he only lived to 29. He was so popular that when he wrote his blank verse, the way he wrote, it was called Marlowe's Mighty Line. It's sort of like if you were a songwriter today and they named a verse, that style of music after you. They named this style of playwright after Marlowe. He has several best-known plays, which are mentioned in the book: Tribulane, Edward II, The Jew of Malta, and Dr. Faustus, all of which you can still see performed today, all of which mix comedy and tragedy. The next big playwright was Ben Jonson. What makes him very interesting, aside from being a classical writer, is he really hated Shakespeare. He disliked Shakespeare. He would go around and say Shakespeare knew small Latin and less Greek. Remember, this was the neoclassic time. We were rediscovering Greek and Roman literature, which was written in Greek and Latin. Ben was a classical writer, and he believed in the unities. He followed Aristotle's ideas on what a play should be. He is known for writing very biting and bitter satire. Some of his plays were Every Man in His Humor. Remember, in medieval times, every man was a character. He took it and turned it into a comedy. He wrote Volpone. He wrote The Alchemist. And he wrote what were called masques. Now, when James I inherited the throne, Jonson would entertain the court with what were called masques. It was a style of theater. It was a lot of great extravaganzas, lots of song, lots of dance, lots of reciting of different parts, kind of influenced by the Commedia dell'arte. And the court would spend a lot of money on what were called masks. It was called masks because a lot of the people would wear masks. This is sort of where the masquerade balls came from. In one production, James I spent the equivalent of $500,000. This is essentially spending $500,000 for a private party. A lot of this went to the extravagant costumes and the sets, which were designed by Inigo Jones, who's a very famous Italian. Sadly, he's one of my favorite designers, a personal hero of mine, and we don't have much time to go on him. In the slides, you'll notice a sketch of one of Inigo Jones' costume designs. He was sort of one of the superstars of the day when it came to theater design, particularly involving opera. Now, of course, you can't do Elizabethan Theatre without the big name of William Shakespeare, who is considered the greatest of all English dramatists. Actually, a little is known about Shakespeare as far as his biography, as far as his personal life. We know he was born in Stratford-upon-Avon. His father was a glover, made gloves, and for a while was a respected town official. Shakespeare attended the grammar school. This was his only formal education, and then he sort of dropped out. At the age of 18, he married Anne Hathaway. She was 8 years his older and gave him 3 children. After a while, he left his wife and the 3 children to go to London. Nobody really knows why. Lots of theories, nothing in writing. There he began working in theater. He started as an actor, finally became a manager, and finally became a writer. His career was pretty much firmly established near the 1600s, 1596, because he was held in favor by Queen Elizabeth. Queen Elizabeth actually granted him a coat of arms. What a coat of arms is pretty much saying you are now considered nobility regardless of what your birth was. He wrote histories, largely based on Greek history, comedies, tragedies, and of course fantasies. He's well known for his skillful plots, his development of character, and of course his majestic use of language. If you study language and speech and theater, you study Shakespeare. He's well known for soliloquies. Soliloquies are sort of standalone speeches. They were done on stage, and they were when the actor had something going in his head that you needed to know about. So the actor would give this soliloquy explaining what his inner thoughts are to the audience. So it wasn't spoken to the characters on stage, it was a little look of you inside the mind of the character. Many of these stand alone on their own. You can find many books on just soliloquies to analyze and read. They are essentially considered a form of poetry. And Shakespeare, with his great command of language, came up with lots of phrases which are used today. I'm not going to go through all of them because there are hundreds. But if you hear phrases like grim necessity from Shakespeare, it's Greek to me from Shakespeare. A rose by any other name, again from Shakespeare. I haven't slept a wink, that comes from Shakespeare. And of course, the famous all the world's a stage, which comes from Shakespeare. And it is a soliloquy. Now, in Elizabethan time, the theaters began being built in a different way in England and were very, very well known today. The first public playwright, the one everybody would go to, was simply called the theater. And it was built by a gentleman named James Burbage around 1576. It held about 1,500 people. It was built outside the city of London, so it didn't have to follow the city's jurisdiction. A little more freedom out there. Because of this, eventually other theaters began popping up, and eventually the famous Globe was built. Playhouses were modeled upon the inn yards. Previous to the theater, as people would go to the inns. These are sort of the bars which served food. People hung out there. They drank, they had their smokes, they ate their food, they talked about village life. As theater expanded away from the church, since people were hanging out there, this was where they would perform, and they would perform outside in the streets by the inns. So the theaters were modeled after the inns, particularly the inn yards. Theater was largely outside. And they were called wooden O's. The reason is because the theaters themselves were either round or octagonal to people sit around. They usually contain thatch roofs. Thatch is the bundle of straw put together. Classic if you ever look at any English pictures. They would have 3 or 4 levels. They were open. They were surrounded a little court where the people could stand on 3 sides. And on one end was a large platform, which was the acting area. Essentially consider it the beginning of the stage. And it was often equipped with trapdoors. Once again, that comes from the Renaissance, or from medieval times with the religious plays doing the special effects. Now, the theaters had lots of little areas. You don't have to memorize them all, but they had an area called the Discovery Space. It was located between the 2 doors at the back of the stage. So it was essentially the center stage. It's sort of where you discovered the plays. And it was used for interior setting. They didn't have scenery in Shakespeare's time. They had to point to the stage and say, we're in the woods. If you read Shakespeare and the plays from this time, the actors are quite awfully, Mr. Cook can't speak today, are quite often describing where they're at. Well, this little back kind of inset areas was considered an inside space. So this would be example at the end of Romeo and Juliet, where they're in the tombs and they're going to kill themselves. That would be an inside area. So that was used for interior settings. There were 2 doors, which essentially led to backstage for exits and brought to an area where the actors could change. I mentioned before these buildings had several levels. The second level would be another acting space, balconies, stuff like that. There was a 3rd level, which could also be an acting space, but was usually with the musicians. Remember, this was outdoor entertainment. They liked live sound. To keep the audience going, they would often use music. There was also a 4th level. They called it the hut. This is usually where they kept the devices and the mechanics for doing the special effects. The plays were always held in the afternoon because at night you couldn't see it. They did not have electricity yet. They did not have good lights. They did try later on using candles, and that would cause buildings to burn down when the things got rowdy. If you wanted to know what play was going on, they would send up a flag at the theater. If the flag was white, that means today's performances was a comedy. If it was black, it meant the performances was a tragedy. All classes of people attended these, the poor people and the rich people. Try to imagine, remember, this is hundreds of years ago. They didn't have TVs, they didn't have movies. Even with the printing press, they didn't have daily newspapers. So try to imagine putting all your dramas, your telenovelas, the books you read, radio you listen to, television, the stuff on your phone, and the newspapers, and roll all that entertainment into one. This is what theater was like for the Elizabethans. In other words, life was tedious. This is where you could go hang out with your friends. This is where you could see what was fashionable. This is where you could hear the music. This is where you could catch up on the news. This is where you could actually watch something on stage. Now, when they went, there was a group of people called the groundings. This is largely the people who stood on the ground in front of the theater. They were the townspeople, the soldiers, the apprentice, and the servants. They would pay a penny, and they got to sit around the stage. Lords and ladies, they would pay a little more, and they could sit in the gallery up off the ground. Occasionally, a few rich would get to sit on the stage. Part of this was a status symbol. If they were up on the stage, they would be seen by everybody. Now, when you went to there, it was quite a rowdy atmosphere. Once again, it was everything rolled into one. This is where everybody gathered, drank, and ate, and so on. So there were peddlers selling oranges and nuts, which people just ate noisily, scarfing it down. And sometimes they would be thrown by the audience if they didn't like the actors. You see this often referred to in cartoons with the rotten tomatoes where people were throwing. This goes back to there. I mentioned before there wasn't any scenery. You had to use your imagination and listen to the actors, to what the playwright put in the script. Quite often it was as simple as one actor saying, the woods, the castle. Some props were used to help establish the characters, daggers, a lot of death in Shakespeare. And they had some sound effects, which was often provided by the band, just to set the mood. Costumes are interesting because everybody thinks of Elizabethan costumes as if they were in a Shakespeare play, as if they were designed that way. They were hand-me-downs. What it is the rich people, the patrons of the arts of support theater, would give them their old outfits. So that's what the actors wore. They didn't try to copy theater. If they did a Roman play or a Greek play on the time, they very seldom wore the togas. They wore the clothing that was handed down. So you could look on stage and you could see Julius Caesar or Dr. Faust, and would be wearing whatever was the fashion of Renaissance theater. There were a few stylized costumes to help certain characters put apart. These were usually characters like the fairies in Midsummer Night's Dreams, or witches, or lawyers. People didn't like lawyers, so they wanted them distinguished so you knew who to throw the rat and fruit at, and churchmen. The players and actors at the time, only men were actors. The equal rights had not come into England yet. The women parts were usually played by young boys whose voices hadn't changed yet, or older guys who could do a nice falsetto. Acting was quite strenuous, much like the commedia dell'arte going on in the rest of Europe. They required singing, lots of dancing, lots of fighting and fencing in Shakespeare. Everybody thinks of sword fights when you think of Romeo and Juliet and other plays, as well as memorizing lines which actors have to normally do. Now, from this time period, there's three actors that we still remember today: Richard Burbage, Edward Allen, and William Kemp. Now, Richard Burbage was the man who built the theater. Remember, the first theater was built by a Burbage. A lot of wealthy people would use their wealth and their influence to get in theater. And hopefully, as you're discovering in theater class, if you get up and act, it's a lot of fun. And it's kind of addictive, and it's a great rush. Burbage was also born in Stratton-upon-Avon. No idea if he knew Shakespeare or not. He is famous for playing very tragic figures. Hamlet, Othello, Richard III, and King Lear. The very deep parts, the very deep dramas. Him and his brother Curbit, they're actually the ones who built the Globe Theater. Probably helped them get the part. If you build the theater, there's a pretty good chance you're going to get a part doing it. The next actor to look at was Edward Allen. He also played lots of dramas, but he played them from Christopher Marlowe's plays. He played Tamerlane, Dr. Faustus, and Barnabas from The Jew of Malta. All of those were written by Christopher Mallard, and they were dramas. He also constructed the Fountain Theatre with his partner Phil Henslow. Remember, a lot of people didn't like Shakespeare. He was kind of in that crowd, so they wanted to do their own. And they built the Fountain Theatre to compete with the Globe. The last actor we're going to look at is William Kemp. He was kind of considered a comedian and a clown. And he is greatest known for playing the part of Nick Bottom in Midsummer's Night Dream. Midsummer's Night Dream is a fantasy about fairies who pull people into it and kind of mess with them using their fairy magic and time of day. Nick Bottom is considered the fool in this play, and at one part, his head is transferred into the head of a donkey. Another name for a donkey is an ass. So he is literally on stage turned into an ass. Now, Shakespeare wrote this part essentially to humiliate Kemp. Kemp would get on his nerves. So he wrote this part about playing the fool just to mess with him. We know this because on one of the rare scripts they found of Shakespeare, he actually refers to the character Bottom as Kemp. However, it sort of backfired, and in the play, Kemp grabbed that part and ran with it, played it completely over the top. The audience loved it. It became famous. And to these days, the way the part of Nick Bottom is played in Midsummer's Night Dream is based a lot on that idea of playing this character over the top and just sort of running with it. Now, sadly, this did not last forever. After the death of Elizabeth I, Civil War broke out. Remember, there were lots of wars. France was in a bunch of them. During the Civil War in England, Oliver Cromwell, who was the leader of the Puritans, he seized control of the government. Now, the Puritans, a religious group, they have always been against theater. And they considered it the den of iniquity. In other words, where people hang out and do bad things. So they closed all the theaters and a lot of other things around England. Thus, the public theater essentially died. Now, there was some sort of like underground public theater. Some people try to do a little like pop-up theater, what we call guerrilla theater today. And there's lots of records of them, of the performers and the audience being arrested and persecuted by the Puritans at this time. This did not last forever, and eventually Charles II regained control around 1660. And he rescued theater, and he began a period of history and a period of theater called the Restoration. And that is going to be our next lecture. So, once again, if there are any questions, leave me a message on the site or email me at jcook@sisd.net. I hope you enjoyed today's lecture and learned a little more about Shakespeare.